With the success of the most recent dinosaur zoo, many different and new projects lay on the horizon as well. Word had already spread that the money holders were working on something big and would open a park with attractions and sights never experienced before. But that was still in the current makings. For now, the next project would focus on something else, but was nevertheless very special too. During the creation of the last prehistoric zoo, the scientists went wild with their DNA splicing and artificial creations. Many insane-looking creatures were brought to life, but among those were some prehistoric creatures that were not dinosaurs in fact, but mammals like the mammoth or the woolly rhino. These animals have become giant successes too, and they gave one of the higher-ups the idea to create a prehistoric park with ancient creatures that weren't dinosaurs. Though indeed the park would be a lot smaller than the main prehistoric zoo, and the scientists had not been able to create as many prehistoric creatures that weren't dinosaurs, there were a lot more than you might think. A few had already been shown off to the world, including the mammoth, the rhinos, and the kelencan. And so many were excited to think about the potential of creatures that would be on display from the times even before the dinosaurs roamed the earth to afterward. The first drafts had been laid out for the park, and this smaller one would be built near a calm coastal area which was easy to reach via the monorail. The opening lane had been placed, and immediately to people's left side when they entered would be the prehistoric village, with all its commonly known forms of entertainment, including the gift shop, restaurants, arcades, bowling alleys, and more. But the park's architects this time wanted the people to immediately enjoy some of the ancient creatures already when they entered, so on the opposite side were the first outlines for the animal zones created. Now people of course still needed to do some shopping and get income going for the park, so the higher-ups wanted to make sure that the animals here would not be the star attraction, so that both the attention given to the shopping area and the nearby animals was in balance. And so, for the first creature to be brought over to this prehistoric park was the Diplocollis. It was an animal shown in a lot of references when talking about evolution throughout the ages. In video format, it was often used to transition from the sea creatures to those on land. But this was simply the case because the Diplocalis was an amphibian. Nevertheless, the well-known image, most commonly noted by its unique shaped head, made it a perfect first attraction to the park. The Diplocollis were pretty fragile creatures, an attribute that they shared with other, more modern amphibians as well. They did not have any defensive mechanisms, and would therefore lay still in the ground to hide, which they were experts at due to their flat build, or head into the water, where they would burrow themselves into the sand as well, and become pretty much invisible. They were very large compared to the amphibians we know today, and could become bigger than 1 meter. But compared to some of the other animals that would be featured in the park, they were relatively small, and therefore multiple Diplocollis were brought over. The audience reception for the animals was great, since they were animals that had not been on display yet in the previous zoos and safari parks. Now, in order to please these creatures, their zone would have to consist of a swamp-like area with lots of shade, plenty of water and tall grass where they could feel safe. Now the tall grass did make it to where they were difficult to spot sometimes for the audience, but from time to time they could be lucky and witness one of the Diplocollis laying on one of the rocks to dry a bit in the sun. When they were unlucky, the animals would indeed be in the water and be nearly invisible. But nevertheless, the first edition was a big hit, and the people were very excited for what would come next. And what would come next was pretty spectacular. The higher-ups wanted to start off with something gentle, something fluffy and cute, as this would still be initiated within the vicinity of the shopping area. In the future, there would be various creepy crawlers added as well, but they did not want them positioned near the entrance, since it was not the intent to creep out any visitors while they were having a Brontosaurus burger at the nearby restaurant. Actually, the flat nature of the Diplocollis' head made it to where they would serve triangular-shaped Diplocollis pancakes nearby that were a great hit with the kids. But for the next animal that would be added, they created the Megatherium. As the name would suggest, this creature was enormous and comparable to an elephant in modern day. But instead, it was a fluffy mammal that was part of the sloth family. Therefore, despite its size, it was one of the most docile and friendly creatures out there. There would only be a few animals that would be added later that were bigger than these gentle giants. Obviously, the appeal could be seen right away, as their soft-spoken look and fluffiness made them perfect mascots, or at least great animals to make toys, like stuffed animals. Four of them were flown over, and put in the new zone, which went without a hitch. Despite their slow nature, they did not seem the least bit stressed out by being so near all the visitors and the busy shopping streets. Their perception of the world around them just was focused on eating, sleeping, and relaxing. The company of the three others of the same species made it to where they weren't lonely, and all four showed great comfort with their new home. Normally, they would use their long claws not to defend themselves, but to stand up against or climb up larger trees to get at the fruits, berries, and nuts higher up. Since they would be fed through a feeder here, they did not need to use that feature though. Some were afraid that they might peek over the fences, which they could do easily, but never with the intent of something malicious. As expected, they were a huge hit with a younger audience yet again, and those stuffed Megatherium animals were a big success as well. And thus, the park now had two different inhabitants, and people flew over from all across the world to get a glimpse of both these creatures that had never been on display before. Yet for the third animal, the higher-ups wanted something a bit more spectacular, or at least famous. Though what they had planned next wasn't necessarily spectacular in terms of size, because it was quite small in comparison, but it was definitely one of the most famous ancient mammals to have ever roamed the earth, and they could not wait to introduce the public to these magnificent beasts. They would introduce the world to the Smilodon, more commonly known as the saber-toothed tiger. The new prehistoric park was coming along nicely. The whole premise for this particular zoo was that all the animals weren't dinosaurs, but instead other mammals, insects, and reptiles. The first two editions were great successes already, but for the next edition, the higher-ups wanted something more famous, and thus the Smilodon was added, which in the common tongue was referred to as the saber-toothed tiger. When one would think about the ancient mammals that had gone extinct, undoubtedly the image of the mammoths would come to mind, as did the image of a saber-tooth. Their physical build was not necessarily big, though of course they were way more massive than the average cats we know and love today. The biggest discovered saber-tooth weighed around 220 kilos, and though its size was pretty small, it was believed that it hunted pretty big prey. A lot was uncertain about the saber-tooth, and by recreating them through science, they hoped to shed some light on the answers that we sought. For example, it was unknown what kind of pattern the fur would have had of the saber-tooths, and throughout history, men adapted similar patterns to that of tigers and lions to it, though these scientists went for a leopard print as they thought it mixed better with the jungle all around. Their distinct feature were of course the large fangs hanging from their mouth. But even here, there were still mysteries laying await on how they were utilized. If the prey they hunted was indeed large, the fangs could be used more as hooks to refrain the prey from fleeing and dealing a killing blow by biting it many times over, rather than a quick snap like we see modern lions do to smaller prey like antelopes. Then again, if it meant a lot of work to take down a potential prey, it would not have been uncommon for the saber-tooth to hunt in packs similar to that of lions. But a discussion on this is also still ongoing, since others believe that the saber-tooth lived secluded on its own in a more forested area similar to that of a black panther or leopard. To avoid too much stress, the scientists chose to only stick to a couple of saber-tooths and see how they would react. They had plenty of room to move around in and seek shade if need be, and the peace and quiet definitely seemed to do them good. They were also a huge hit with the audience, and many people's first reaction was that they expected it to be bigger. One could guess that through art, movies, and pop culture, the stories and image of the Smilodon had made it bigger, literally, than it actually was. But here, in front of everyone's eyes, stood the actual saber-tooth, with a few artistically free nicks and knacks presented by the scientists themselves. Then for the next creature that would be added to the park, a lesser known, yet visually very impressive specimen would be added. It regarded the aquatic arthropod, Pterygotus. Now, as mentioned before, this creature was aquatic in nature, and it was to be believed that it was not able to traverse on land, for its tiny, thin legs lacked the spinal structure to support its own weight. A Pterygotus could become the size of a modern man with long claws that actually had fully developed teeth on the inside to which it could catch its prey in the water. Now, since the park was not able to hold any fully aquatic zones, that was in the making for later in this year, some adjustments needed to be made to this creature to where it could walk on land as well. Thus, its legs were artificially made sturdier, and through sprinkler systems set throughout the zone, it would not dry out when it was on land. Nevertheless, the zone itself of course still would have plenty of water where it would feel most at home. Food would be provided through a meat feeder outside the water, but at the same time plenty of fish would also be released so that they could hunt them freely. Their flat nature made them yet again pretty difficult to see when they were moving through the tall grass or submerged. But many thought that they looked very much like aliens, so they got their share of popularity, though many were also grossed out once they finally caught a glimpse. This corner would definitely function as the creepy crawler section, and opposite of the zone, plans were already being arranged for another creature that had plenty of legs to spare. But that would come in due time, because for now, the next animal that would be added to the park was a golden oldie. The Kelencan, also known as the terror bird, had seen the light of day back in the previous zoo and was popular for its ferocious and dangerous look. It was indeed very aggressive by nature, but with inhibitors, it could be made as docile as a puppy. Now, nothing could be done for the aggressive demeanor, however, but many thought that the look was very impressive. They enjoyed being at the top of the food chain back when they roamed freely, and by their movement and behavior, it became all the more apparent how much dinosaurs were connected to birds rather than reptiles. Now, though they were indeed very popular, some of the younger children visiting the park were a bit intimidated or even scared by their presence, and so they were put further away from the shopping district and entrance. They were put closer to the actual coast, meaning they could enjoy the cool summer breeze coming straight from the ocean's direction. Not too many giant carnivores would be added to this park, so the Kelencan was definitely a highlight on that regard. Despite being familiar, and for now the first of the animals to be reiterated in the park, the Kelencan's popularity did not diminish. It might have been because people felt that it felt more organic to have it roam between these animals rather than the dinosaurs. It fitted better as a whole, and for the next coming weeks, the Kelencan were the new 5-star attraction. The park had been expanded quite a bit in such a short time. There were still plenty of new animals to be brought in that never had been showcased to the world before in previous parks. Some of the guests were already impressed to begin with on how many different species they had in the park right now. It kept the people guessing on what would come next. Now, the newest creature that would be added was another bird, but this time way smaller. But ironically, it was a lot more famous than the Kelencan, and the money holders expected a lot from these jittery new critters. They would reintroduce the world to the Dodo. The hype and enthusiasm that surrounded this small bird was immense. In a way, since the dodo went extinct in the 17th century, it was an animal that only went extinct fairly recently, all things considered. For that reason, it received a special place with the people, since it was closer to our time than something like a dinosaur or even something massive as a mammoth. Now, the reason why it went extinct was a mixture of habitat loss, but also losing competition with other newly introduced, further evolved animals. It was a perfect example of survival of the fittest, though the human expansion had an artificial role to play in as well. Since the dodo were so innocent by nature, there were even some who thought it might be possible to introduce the dodo back into our modern ecosystem and see how it would do. It would not pose a threat, and if it would be deemed plausible that they had a future, this may yet actually happen. The newest prehistoric park was coming along nicely. Though in scope, it was of course a lot smaller than the main safari and zoo, it still had its share of fans that wanted to see these exotic animals. It did the higher-ups good, knowing that there was an interest with prehistoric creatures that were not necessarily only dinosaurs. Recently, another handful of new creature discoveries were made that were now able to be manufactured, so there was a bright future to be had for sure. With the addition of the Calancan, a golden oldie was brought back in, and despite the familiarity, people flew in from all across the world to see it in a habitat that was more to its own. The newest and most anticipated creature to see the light of day, however, was the famous Dodo. It was incredible to think that such a small creature could shoulder so much fame and popularity. Now granted, it wasn't necessarily popular because it was so awe-inspiring, but many people still felt a connection with the dodo, since they went, all things considered, extinct only recently, within the last 300 years, rather than thousands and thousands of years ago. No, it was indeed not their design or looks, because if one were to focus in on that, it could become quite clear why they went extinct and why they probably did not have a big chance to survive throughout the ages, even if the human race had not interfered. They were small, jitterish, and were not able to fly. Even with birds today that are at a big disadvantage on land, like penguins, they excel in gaining incredible speeds when entering the water. The dodo, on the other hand, did not have any of that. If it was attacked, it could not fly away, it could not swim away, and most likely, it would try and run away. But its legs were also not built for speed, and a scenario where a dodo would escape with its life, let alone be victorious in a confrontation, was highly unlikely. Yet in this park, they of course had nothing to fear, and since the birds were so small, a lot could be flown over to showcase how social of a species they were. They were so small, in fact, that yet again it was an animal that could easily hide themselves in the tall grass. But in this case, the quantity assured the visitors a good glimpse of at least one dodo to be had. One thing that was peculiar was that the dodo was a fairly quiet bird species when compared to other grouping species like geese or penguins. If one were to look at those animals, there would be constant ear-deafening noise, as the individual birds would let their position and mood be known to one another. It was their way to find relatives within that large pack of cluttered feathered creatures. But the dodo did not have this, indicating that there might be different mechanisms on how they communicated or would inform the others of their position, mood, or potential predator threat. Now that the dodos had been properly introduced to the visitors, it was time to move on to the next creature. But before that, some adjustments to the park facilities would need to be made. More land would have to be excavated for the new animal zones, and they wanted to erect a giant research and information center with all sorts of exhibits near the shore. It would also be here where multiple luxurious hotels would be built, where the guests would have a gorgeous view over the park itself. Now, to appeal to its stay, some really impressive animals would be put next to the hotel as well. Guests would not have a great start of the day if they woke up and saw a giant centipede or toad in front of their hotel when they looked out from their balcony. Something large and majestic would need to be added, so the newest animals to grace the park was the Megatherium, another creature that had already been shown to the world before. Though this gentle giant had already been introduced in the main dinosaur zoo, its incredible display still left people in utter awe. It was so much bigger than something like a modern elephant, demanding respect from anyone looking up at it from up close or down from the balconies of the hotel. Multiple of these enormous beasts would be flown over, and the migration was always a massive operation. In this case, also literally. There was always some anxiety, since if something were to go wrong during the movement of an animal of this size, there could be a chance it turned into a frantic panic and start rampaging all over. Luckily for most creatures in this particular zoo, they were not of the size to where they could easily trample the visitors, except these massive herbivores. The same caution was used for the sedating process, but luckily, all of the steps and stages went without any hiccups, demanding a lot of media attention once more when the people saw these creatures fly over their heads. It was still a sight that awed people beyond belief. They moved slow and gentle, with some elegance even, making it indeed the perfect poster child for being near the new hotel facility area. The zone for the Paraceratherium that was reserved was also massive, and could, on paper, even house more animal species if this zone were to be a kind of safari mixed zone. But that would all come in due time, and for now, these giants that were related to the modern day rhino needed to be initiated. Despite being fairly close to the Kalinkan, they had nothing to fear because of their sheer size, and the animals were all at ease. It was also a massive contrast with the small and jittery dodos, and seeing on how gentle both creatures were, there were those suggesting to maybe put both the dodo and the Paraceratherium in the same area. But there lay some serious danger for the dodos to be stepped on, since they were so small that their bigger roommates could not properly see them. With another success underway with these giant herbivores, the steam train just kept on rolling to introduce yet another new creature. Though new was yet again a bit too quick to conclude, since the Dimetrodon would be next. This was the first animal to be brought over to the main zoo, but of course belonged in a park where dinosaurs did not roam. By having them already in the main zoo, the scientists knew a lot regarding their behavior and personalities. Though they might look a bit menacing, their movements were very slow due to their horizontal build. Their legs were not as lean and agile as something like a lizard. They would depend on speed by swimming in shallow waters, and back in their time, they were considered an apex, meaning that the limited movement they had on land did not prove to be an issue. They would feed on smaller fish, reptiles, and amphibians, so plenty of those would be added to the scenery as well. It created some more bustling life within their zone already. One of the things that was still so beautiful about the Dimetrodons were their bright and varied color palettes. Though the main zoo definitely had plenty of exotic, colorful species, this zoo yet had to have such a creature, and thus the Dimetrodon almost functioned as the colorful parrots of the prehistoric park. It was mainly this exotic look that still made them very popular, despite the guests being familiar with them for several years already. And then the next creature already lay in wait to be introduced, and this one would be a creature that would send shivers along the spines on those hating bugs and other creepy crawlers. As mentioned before, the park's higher-ups wanted to create a corner full of these creepy crawlers and scarier looking animals, and thus the next insect that would be brought in was the Arthropleura, the giant centipedes. The new prehistoric zoo was ever expanding, and though it was mentioned that this project would be much smaller compared to the main zoo and safari park, by now it had gotten to a significant size. It was not uncommon for people to spend their entire day here with the family rather than just a few hours or afternoon. It was true that a tour around the park could be done in less than 1 hour, but there was a lot of other entertainment as well, and the animals themselves were so magnificent and rare that they often would demand a second look and roundabout. For the newest edition though, some creepy crawlers were being added in the form of the Arthropleura. These creatures were shaped and formed after the modern centipede Scolopendra. The actual Arthropleura, however, might have looked and behaved significantly different. Their size was of course the first thing that came to mind. There was a large variable in sizes to begin with, making it a bit more difficult to assure specimens were created that would wow the audience. They could be as large as 3 meters, but also as small as 30 centimeters. No one wanted to see a 30 centimeter creature, so the scientists made sure to only send over the largest and scariest looking ones. Now, when one thinks about centipedes, more often than not, the association is negative. It's either poisonous, very aggressive, or scary in that it's a carnivore. Though these Arthropleura had also been created with the DNA splicing genomes that made them a carnivore, it has become a more popular theory over the years that these creatures were actually herbivores. If they were indeed carnivorous, like modern centipedes, their mouths would have been much sturdier, meaning they would have been retained and fossilized. But not a single fossil has been found with its mouth still intact, pointing to a theory that they were herbivores. Now, these creepy crawlers lived in wet tropical areas. It's part also why they went extinct back in the day as the earth dried up, losing all its tropical rainforest areas. As with the zone opposite of them, several sprinklers were installed to make sure the temperature and moisture would be at the perfect level, and the Arthropleura really thrived in this environment. They were very active and crawled all over the place, giving the audience something really unique to look at. Though there was not a significant color variation with its pattern, the color itself was very fiery and aggressive looking, again leaning in on the fact that the modern centipedes were taken as the blueprints for its looks. Now, seeing as this corner would contain the more exotic and scary looking creatures, it was also the perfect area to introduce the next animal in the form of the Dinosuchus. This giant prehistoric crocodile, of course, already made its debut back in the main dinosaur zoo, but over time, the scientists had made some adjustments to the looks and behavior of this magnificent creature. Its looks were leaner, more aggressive looking, while still holding on to that familiar sight of a proper crocodile. Maybe, when one were to look at just a picture of these, it would not be that special, but the distinct difference was of course its giant size. Normally, with modern crocodiles, one could stand behind it and would be relatively safe since the crocodile was not as agile to where it could easily perform a 180-degree turn. With the size of the Dinosuchus, however, he could easily punch you forward with a tail whip and snap at you with its powerful jaws. Despite having received behavioral inhibitors, extreme caution was still advised since the instincts were ever present in this animal species, of which we can still see the results today. Together with sharks, these crocodiles are one of the few things we have still left and inherited from ancient times. Luckily, the requirements and needs for these crocodiles were a lot less complicated than the Arthropleura or its other neighbor. Though they needed, of course, plenty of water, they also required a lot of open space to where they could heat and warm up in the sun. Nothing had changed regarding their cold-bloodedness, and in the early morning and late night, there was hardly any movement with them, whereas during the day, there was plenty of it. They were also very active during the moving itself, but that must have been the shock or fear of being sedated and then flown over by helicopter. That would give anyone a bad hangover. Though the audience had already introduced themselves to the Dinosuchus a while back, many were still excited and thrilled to see this newer and improved version, making it almost sound like an improved taste of soda drink or other food item. But many agree that these versions look much better, demanding so much more respect and awe from anyone laying their eyes upon them. Because the focus of the animals that were added in the past weeks had been on the more creepy or scary side, many of the higher-ups thought that it was time to introduce the audience once again to something familiar that would not immediately send them running away. The Leptobos was yet another animal that had seen the light of day in the previous zoo, but was of course also welcomed with open arms in this particular park. The Leptobos was closer related to a bison, but for the look and feel, the scientists went with something more similar to that of a wildebeest. It was yet again one of those animals where the similarities in looks with modern ones could not be denied, but the main difference was its size. Despite their giant, fearsome-looking horns, these were some of the most docile creatures to be added, and they were the perfect candidate to have in a mixed pen with some of the other animals. For now, they would receive their own zone, as the higher-ups were thinking about making a separate area in the park specifically for a mixed area of different types of animals. As these were herd animals, the scientists made sure to fly over plenty to make them feel at home. Though they were fond of grazing on the open steppes and fields, there was not a whole lot of room here near the shore. But they were very content and happy with the new home that they received. The social behavior of this magnificent animal immediately showcased itself, since they were always paired up with at least one other member of the small group. Though they were a bit nervous in the beginning, it did not take long before all of them let their guard down and they could spend most of their day just grazing and chewing that delicious grass over and over. It's just what cows do. By now, a lot of the animals have been added to the park, and truth be told, that the finish line could be seen on the horizon. There were still a few highlights to be added, including the woolly rhino and the mammoth of course, but the other creatures that were still available could be counted on one hand. For the next introduction though, they wanted to bring in something original once more, since the people had already seen the rhinos and the mammoths before. So for the next edition in the park, the Gigantopithecus was given green light. The smaller zoo, besides the main dinosaur one, was coming to its end. The finish line could be seen on the horizon. Only a handful of other creatures were still on the conveyor belt, waiting to be presented to the audience and worldwide public. Currently, the scientists were still busy with making the final preparations for some of the prehistoric creatures, and they asked the audience for maybe some suggestions of prehistoric animals that weren't dinosaurs for the scientists to create. And with that, I'm breaking the fourth wall here for a bit. Hey viewers! With how things are going, the next episode will probably be the last one, seeing I only have one more animal to showcase after this episode. So, if you know of any more prehistoric animal mods for Jurassic World Evolution that think will fit this season, then please let me know in the comments below. Over time, this relatively small zoo had grown into a large sprawling attraction park catering to all sorts of visitors. It had fluffy, cute-looking animals, scary and awe-inspiring beasts, creepy crawlers, and majestic giants. All sorts of different flavors, and the news that it would reach its grand and official finished opening pretty soon had everyone excited. But until that time arrived, more animals would need to be brought over. The latest addition was the Gigantopithecus, the giant primate. Roamed the forests of what China used to be and lived a relatively quiet life. Due to its large size of 3 meters, it did not have to fear a lot of predators. Though it could live off of other food types like meats, nuts, and leaves, it mostly relied on fruit to survive, and its sheer size and changing of climate ultimately led to its downfall. It simply was not able to secure enough food for itself, thereby actually having the smaller ones being able to survive and evolution doing the work into making smaller primates like we know today. In many cases, the Darwin theory of survival of the fittest means that the biggest and strongest survive. But in this case, it can also be said that a species can actually become too big to where it cannot sustain its own needs or body. For the look of this Gigantopithecus, the scientists went with something resembling an orangutan, though various art through the years have also portrayed it closer to that of a gorilla. The red hue of its fur shined beautifully in the sun, and even though these were ancient animals, nothing changed in terms of their need to be with other species of their own. They were very social animals in that regard. A few of the scientists showed some concerns with these creatures, as they were of course able to use their motor functions a bit better than most other animals in the park. They could easily grab things like the fence and tear it down, so extra care was being taken on using the behavior prohibitors to make sure things stayed peaceful. But the giant apes posed no threat whatsoever and seemed to love their new habitat. A matriarch took the lead, and the others were often seen following her wherever she went. In contrast to something like a raptor pack, though there was indeed a hierarchy with a clear leader, it wasn't like the leader would not share with others. Everyone could eat and drink at the same time, and the caretakers would be sure to provide them with enough fruit so that history would not repeat itself. The next animal that would be introduced had already seen the light of day in the main dinosaur zoo, and would now also be added here. The Este Menosuchus was still one of the most bizarre looking creatures here. Its name literally meant crowned crocodile due to its unique skull shape, where it seemingly had horns, antlers, or simply pieces of bone sticking outside its head. There have been many discussions and many doubts about whether they were indeed horns or antlers, but for this particular creation, the scientists went with that theory. There are some that mean that this creature resembled more of a modern cow than what we see in most books and other art. The irony too is that were one to look at this particular skull shape, and even teeth, similarities could be found with bears, so still a lot was incomplete and unknown about this specific animal. There have been many incomplete specimens found, so the scientists themselves were also kinda grasping in the dark. The Este Menosuchus was an omnivore, with these species yet again emphasized by its teeth since it had sharp fangs for cutting up and chewing up meat, but also had more flat ones in the back to where it could crush leaves, fruits, and nuts. They could reach a length of 3 meters, but they were a bit more pudgy and short. That actually also made them cute in a weird way, and the audience members who laid their eyes upon these mysterious creatures often did not know what they were looking at exactly. There really wasn't anything like it, yet it shared characteristics with multiple animals at the same time. They were not a species that really migrated a lot, and would often stay with its own herd and graze where they were at. That made them extremely easy to put into a new zone without the panic of them running out of control. They did not pose as much of a threat as some of the other animals in the park, but nevertheless, you would not want to see them cranky. And now with these new additions to the park, it was time for another highlight. Maybe the highlight to many, as the mammoths would finally be added to the park, a staple and assurance that had been coming for several months already. But this time, they would be put into a zone with a different animal, namely the woolly rhino. The two creatures complemented each other, and first the rhinos were brought over. The rhinos still make quite the impression, with their large nose horns demanding respect. The color variation depended on a darker fur or brighter, closely resembling the grey and whiteness we know from modern rhinos today. When these animals were flown over, extreme caution was needed to be made when it came to sedating them and flying them to their new zone. A stampede of these creatures was an ultimate nightmare scenario. The rangers were told to do this as quickly as possible, and even though they succeeded, some of the rhinos did get agitated and even hit one of the cars. No one was hurt, luckily, which was a miracle in and of itself. And so the rhinos were then transported to the new zone and could explore it to their heart's content, since it would still take a while before the mammoths would join them. The area was definitely big enough and had varied terrain where they could find a spot for their group to feel at ease. And so with the rhinos situated and not going into a full panic attack, green light was given to fly over the majestic mammoths. These giants were still an incredible sight to behold, and that should be noteworthy, seeing as they were one of the first modified creatures to be added to the main dinosaur park, and still, the demand for them to be added here was massive. Five were flown over, and the rangers were told to use the same precautions when it came to sedating them. Chances were more likely that the darts would feel like mosquito bites to these mammoths, but nevertheless they had to be careful. Luckily everything went fine, and they were transported over, creating an impressive image of flying elephants. People were also a bit nervous on how the rhinos, which had time to acclimate to their new home, would react to these new and sudden invaders. It might have been the sound of the helicopters that upset them more, but in general, they accepted the mammoths for what they were. Maybe a single rhino or so could be seen running a bit stressed here or there, but the rhinos could sense that in general, the mammoths had a very passive personality. All they cared about was just slogging around, drinking water, and eating some delicious leaves. And with that, these iconic animals were paired up, and the people loved it. The zone they were put in was massive, but both species were so gigantic that a sight of them was pretty much always guaranteed. The prehistoric animal zoo was coming to its final moments. With the help of the community and audience members, the scientists were tipped on what other attractions and animal species they would like to see. It took a while to research the data and prepare the steps to have these animals actually be created, but 2 more creatures would be added to the final third one that was already in the making. The zoo really flourished with so many animals now on display, and had become even bigger and more expansive than anyone imagined. The timing was right too, since steps were being made to make a new zoo which was even bigger than the main dinosaur one, with all types of new attractions including aquatic animals and multiple flying types. Hype surrounding this park was starting, and the buzz was good since this particular prehistoric animal zoo was on the brink of being completed. Some were afraid that the zoo would be overshadowed by its dinosaur brethren, but truth be told, in today's age, people are still amused and entertained by seeing something like a lion or a giraffe in a regular zoo, so these animals would always have an audience of their own. And so in the coming weeks, the last 3 animals of the zoo would be added. The first was one of 2 that had been suggested by an audience member, and after gathering data, the scientists indeed came to the conclusion that they were able to bring this specimen to life. It was the Aepyornis maximus, part of the elephant bird family. This magnificent giant walking bird was found in Madagascar and could reach a height of 3 meters. It would weigh at between 300 and 500 kilos, and its eggs would be about 30 centimeters. The blue hue of the head and the neck with some of the birds here was reminiscent of some of the more modern and aggressive species that were its descendants. In fact, those were so aggressive that often 2 could not be in the same living space, as fighting most assuredly would break out. But with the Aepyornis, they were of a more gentle kind and could live in bigger groups, much like ostriches. Though they did not seem to have many defense mechanisms, they could deal some serious damage to any attacker by stomping on them or scratching at them with their powerful legs. They were definitely not very efficient at killing an attacker, but could wound them to where they could run away to safety. Since they had these strong, sturdy legs, they often enjoyed a bit of running around, and thus enough space needed to be secured in their new zone. In that sense, they were remarkably close to that of a Gallimimus, even imitating group and flocking behavior when running across the field. They were a bit jittery at first when being flown over and put in their new home, but seeing as there were so many all flown over at once, they sought comfort with each other. Their hunger and thirst took over, and when most realized that this area was safe from predators, things calmed down. Since these birds were so dependent on the ability to only run away, it was of utmost importance to make the grass area wide without too many patches of jungle. The thick forested jungle could of course potentially harbor enemies and make the birds nervous. Even with most probably being at ease in the zoo, it was still common to see 1 or 2 of the Aepyornis functioning as a lookout while the others went about their own pace. They were very social creatures and could often be seen socializing in smaller groups within the flock itself. The zoo now harbored multiple walking birds, and all in very different kinds. The dodo were small and fluffy. The terror birds were mean looking and ferocious, and these were simply majestic and giant. It was nice to see such a variety within prehistoric creatures like this. Ironically, the next creature would also be of the flying types, and actually was part of the pterosaur family, meaning to some it might have a place in this particular zoo. Nevertheless, with the new dinosaur park on the rise, and this zoo being in its final phase, it couldn't do any harm of adding another unique looking creature. The Hatzegopteryx was the second to last animal that was added to the park. This flying creature was immediately distinguishable due to its unique look. Its enormous head and beak combined with its long neck and its wings often held at a folded position. Despite these animals looking a bit goofy, they were actually considered the apex predator back when they roamed freely, to the point where they enjoyed a meat diet not only consisting of fish, but also bigger animals including dinosaurs. This was also due to the fact that these animals were as big as a giraffe, though not these particular ones. In that sense, the animals that the scientists created differed quite a bit from what the actual animal was like. It was a hunter. Some of their prey would even be too big to swallow whole, and the Hatzegopteryx would gnaw at it with its beak and eat that way. More robust discoveries and conclusions on this flying creature were made in 2002, making it a relatively new addition to the prehistoric database. Though its wingspan might actually look fairly narrow, seeing as it's folded all the time, in fact when it would spread out and fly, it could be considered amongst the biggest of the pterosaurs. It was also in a way an optical illusion, seeing as the size of the head and neck made the other proportions automatically seem smaller. They would often live at rocky coasts of islands where plenty of fish and other prey would be found. In that sense, they could be compared on living habits with several penguins nowadays. Seeing as this zoo was built so close to the coast, all of them felt right at home when they were introduced to their new zone. And then it was time for the final animal to be added to the park. This particular creature had already been planned to be added, but was postponed after the two other bird-like animals were suggested by the audience members. And so the last animal to be showcased in the park was the Thylacoleo. The Thylacoleo had a few other nicknames, including the marsupial lion, tree cat, or simply Thyla. This mammal was one of the first fossil discoveries after European settlement in Australia happened. It was believed to hunt other large prey by ambushing its targets. The Thyla wasn't particularly large, but had enormous claws that it could use as razors to rip open its prey and then keep track of it as it would lose blood and strength. Its proportions and build made it suitable for running, but not necessarily sprinting. Its horizontal structure already made it natural for it to blend in the tall grass and made the impression that it was always sneaking around. Yet it also had something cute about it, and could fit right in that image of these exotic animals only found in Australia. There are also some theories that instead of an ambusher, the Thyla was a scavenger, and would look for scraps, or even some believe it was a herbivore. Initial testing here at the park, however, showed that it indeed lived off of meat. They were pretty individualistic, but also could get along well within a group. Since they were relatively small and had a lot of space to roam around in with their new living zone, the park's benefactors wanted to be sure that there were enough to where the audience would catch a glimpse of at least one. And with that, the final animals were added to the park, and with some final touches, the park would then officially be finished. A few adjustments would be made here and there, and then everyone all around the world could enjoy these marvelous creatures for what they were worth.